There's a specific pattern that emerges in sexual relationships with avoidants that creates profound confusion for their partners. The pattern doesn't match what you'd expect from someone who struggles with intimacy. It doesn't follow the simple narrative of avoidant person avoids all closeness, including physical. Instead, it's complex, contradictory, unpredictable in ways that make you question your understanding of them, of yourself, of what's actually happening between you. The pattern is intense sexual connection that seems to promise deep intimacy, followed by complete withdrawal that makes the sexual intensity feel manipulative or confusing in retrospect. Or periods of high sexual desire and initiation, followed by periods of complete sexual unavailability that have nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with their nervous system's tolerance for intimacy. Or sex that's physically intense but emotionally disconnected, leaving you feeling used despite the mutual pleasure, feeling confused about why something that should create closeness actually creates distance. The avoidant sexual behavior is driven by their attachment trauma in ways that create specific patterns that are confusing because they seem contradictory, patterns that are painful because they create hope through intensity, followed by despair through withdrawal, patterns that are difficult to understand without recognizing how trauma shapes not just emotional intimacy, but physical intimacy in ways that make the physical seem separate from the emotional, even though they're deeply connected in the avoidance psychology. Understanding how avoidant attachment trauma manifests in sexual relationships, why their desire seems so unpredictable, why sex can be simultaneously the place where they're most connected and most offended. Why physical intimacy doesn't create the emotional intimacy it creates in secure relationships. This helps both avoidants understand their own patterns and helps partners understand why the sexual dynamic feels so confusing and why the confusion isn't about your inadequacy, but about how trauma affects the avoidant's capacity for integrated intimacy, where physical and emotional connection exist together, rather than in alternation or opposition. The three core ways attachment trauma affects the avoidant's sexual expression. The avoidant's sexual behavior isn't random. It follows predictable patterns driven by how their early attachment wounds shape their relationship with intimacy, vulnerability, and connection. Pattern 1. Sex becomes safest form of intimacy. Physical connection without emotional vulnerability creates illusion of closeness that feels manageable. For the avoidant, sex is often the one form of intimacy that feels accessible. Physical intimacy without emotional vulnerability. Bodily connection without having to reveal their inner world. Closeness that's time-limited, has beginning, middle, end, rather than the ongoing, unlimited vulnerability that emotional intimacy requires. Sex creates temporary closeness that feels manageable because it's contained, happens in specific time frame, creates connection that feels intense but also feels controllable because it's physical rather than emotional. The avoidant can be present during sex in ways they can't be present during emotional conversation, can let someone close physically while maintaining emotional walls, can experience connection without the terror that emotional vulnerability creates. This makes sex the safest form of intimacy, the place where they can give something, the place where they can receive something, the place where they can experience closeness without triggering their deepest wounds about emotional vulnerability being dangerous. But this also creates problem, because sex becomes substitute for emotional intimacy rather than complement to it, becomes the way they show love instead of one way among many, becomes how they connect instead of one form of connection within relationship that includes many forms. The reliance on sex as primary safe intimacy creates pattern where physical connection is intense, but emotional connection remains absent, in creating confusion about whether real intimacy exists when physical intimacy is present, but emotional intimacy is not. Pattern 2. Sexual desire fluctuates based on intimacy proximity. Intense desire when emotionally distant, decreased desire when emotionally close, creating confusing pattern where sex and emotional connection seem inversely related. The avoidant sexual desire isn't constant, fluctuates in pattern that's confusing to partners who don't understand the pattern. The pattern is high sexual desire when emotional distance is maintained, low or absent sexual desire when emotional closeness increases. This seems backwards. Seems like people should want sex more when they feel emotionally close, not less. But for the avoidant, emotional closeness triggers their wounds, makes them feel vulnerable, and makes them want to create distance. And creating distance while in relationship often means withdrawing sexually. The withdrawal isn't about physical attraction, it's about emotional proximity, feeling threatening, and sexual withdrawal being way to create space. Conversely, when emotional distance exists, after argument, after period of not seeing each other, when relationship feels less emotionally intense, sexual desire increases. Increases because the distance has restored their sense of safety. Because emotional space makes physical closeness feel manageable again. Because sex becomes way to reconnect without having to do emotional vulnerability that feels too threatening. This creates pattern partners find confusing, pursue emotional closeness, and sexual desire disappears. Maintain emotional distance and sexual desire appears. And the pattern makes it seem like avoidant doesn't want intimacy when actually they want physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy makes physical intimacy feel threatening, creating inverse relationship between emotional closeness and sexual desire. Pattern 3. Sex can be compartmentalized from emotion, creating capacity for intense physical connection with minimal emotional engagement that feels disconnected or hollow to partners seeking integrated intimacy. The avoidant has capacity that secure people generally don't have. Capacity to completely separate physical intimacy from emotional intimacy. To have intense physical connection while maintaining complete emotional walls. To be fully present in body while being completely absent emotionally. This compartmentalization is protective. Protects them from the vulnerability that integrated intimacy would create. Lets them have physical pleasure and physical connection without the emotional exposure that feels dangerous. But compartmentalization creates experience for partner of sex that feels disconnected, feels hollow, feels like something is missing even though physically everything is present. Partner might feel used even though use isn't the intention. Might feel like object even though objectification isn't conscious goal. Might feel confused about why something that should create closeness actually creates distance. The compartmentalization is avoidance protection mechanism, but protection mechanism creates disconnection that undermines the relationship, even while the avoidant believes they're participating in intimacy through physical connection. And they're connecting physically, they're not connecting emotionally. And for partners who need integrated intimacy, where physical and emotional are together rather than separated, the compartmentalized sex feels insufficient regardless of physical intensity. Why the avoidance high sex drive can feel confusing. The difference between desire for connection and desire for release. Understanding what's driving the avoidant sexual desire helps partners distinguish between desire for genuine intimacy and desire for other things that sex provides without intimacy. Sex becomes emotional regulation strategy, using physical intensity to manage uncomfortable emotions without having to process those emotions. For many avoidants, sex functions as emotional regulation. Feeling anxious? Sex creates relief. Feeling overwhelmed? Sex provides release. Feeling disconnected? Sex creates temporary sense of connection without requiring emotional vulnerability. Feeling too close? Sex can create intimacy on their terms, physical terms that feel manageable, rather than emotional terms that feel threatening. The sex isn't primarily about desire for partner. It's about using sex to manage internal emotional state that feels unmanageable through other means. This creates high sex drive that's not actually about sexual desire in traditional sense. It's about needing the regulation that sex provides, about needing the relief, about needing the way sex makes them feel that has little to do with partner and everything to do with their own internal state management. Partners experience this as being wanted sexually, but not being wanted emotionally. Being desired for what they provide through sex, regulation, relief, temporary connection, rather than being desired as whole person, the avoidant wants emotional and physical intimacy with. The high sex drive that's actually emotional regulation strategy creates confusing experience for partner of being intensely desired in specific contexts while feeling emotionally neglected in relationship more broadly. Sex provides validation without vulnerability, confirming desirability and worth through partner's desire without requiring emotional openness. Sex also provides validation for the avoidant, provides confirmation they're desirable, provides evidence they're wanted, provides proof of their worth through partner's sexual desire for them. This validation feels safer than emotional validation because sexual validation doesn't require them to be emotionally vulnerable. They can receive confirmation of desirability through physical connection without having to open emotionally. This makes sex an appealing way to get validation needs met. Can feel wanted, feel desired, feel valuable through sexual connection without the vulnerability that asking for emotional validation would require. The high sex drive is partly drive for validation, for proof they're acceptable, for evidence they matter. But drive for validation through sex creates pattern where they're seeking validation rather than seeking connection. Partner experiences being used for validation purposes, even though use isn't conscious intention. Experiences providing something, validation through desire, that meets avoidance need but doesn't create mutual intimacy because the seeking is one-directional. The sex that's about validation rather than connection creates unsatisfying dynamic for partner, even when partner is willingly providing the sex. High sex drive can coexist with low emotional availability, creating painful pattern where physical desire is present, but emotional intimacy is absent. The confusing part for partners: the avoidant might have high sex drive, might want sex frequently, might initiate often, might seem highly sexual, while simultaneously being emotionally unavailable. The high physical desire coexisting with low emotional availability creates cognitive dissonance, creates confusion about what the sexual desire means. If they want you sexually, shouldn't they want you emotionally? If they desire physical intimacy, shouldn't that translate to desiring emotional intimacy? For avoidant, the answer is no. Physical desire and emotional availability are separate. Can want sex frequently while wanting emotional distance. Can desire physical connection while maintaining emotional walls. Can be highly sexual while being emotionally withdrawn. The coexistence of high sex drive and low emotional availability is what creates the pain. Creates feeling of being wanted only for body. Creates feeling that sex is being used to avoid emotional intimacy rather than to enhance it. Creates confusion about whether the relationship is real, if physical desire is present but emotional connection is not. The pattern is painful, but it's also revealing. For the avoidant, sex and emotional intimacy are compartmentalized enough that one can be high while the other is low, creating the confusing coexistence that makes partners feel used despite mutual physical desire. The unpredictable pattern. Why the avoidant goes from sexually intense to sexually unavailable. The cycling between sexual intensity and sexual withdrawal creates specific confusion for partners trying to understand what changed and why the change seems to have nothing to do with them. Intense sex creates vulnerability hangover. The emotional exposure of physical intimacy triggers need to create distance afterward. After particularly intense sexual connection, the avoidant often withdraws. Not immediately, but in hours or days following. The withdrawal is response to vulnerability hangover, the intense sex-created moment of connection, of openness, of vulnerability, even if vulnerability was physical rather than emotional. And the vulnerability, even physical vulnerability, triggers their wounds, creates fear, creates need to restore distance to feel safe again. The more intense the sexual connection, the stronger the subsequent withdrawal. The better the sex, the more threatened they feel by the intimacy it created. This is backwards from secure pattern. Secure people feel closer after great sex. Want more connection? Move toward partner. Avoidant feels threatened after great sex. Wants distance. Moves away from partner. The intensity, followed by withdrawal, creates painful pattern. Partner experiences great sexual connection, feels hopeful about increased intimacy, reaches for more closeness, encounters withdrawal that feels like rejection. Partner is confused. If the sex was good, why are they pulling away? The withdrawal isn't about the sex being bad. It's about the sex being good enough to create vulnerability that triggers their need to restore protective distance. Emotional closeness decreases sexual desire. Counterintuitive pattern, where feeling emotionally close makes them less sexually interested, not more. Partner pursues emotional intimacy, works to create emotional closeness, succeeds at building emotional connection, and discovers the avoidant sexual desire decreases. This is devastating pattern. You did what you thought was right. Built emotional intimacy that should enhance physical intimacy. But for avoidant, emotional intimacy is threat. Makes them feel too vulnerable, makes the relationship feel too serious, makes them feel too exposed. And when they feel emotionally too close, they create distance, often through withdrawing sexually. The sexual withdrawal isn't about physical attraction decreasing. It's about emotional proximity feeling threatening and sexual unavailability being way to create space. This creates impossible situation for partner. Maintain emotional distance, and avoidant is sexually available but emotionally absent. Build emotional closeness, and avoidant becomes emotionally present but sexually unavailable. Can't have both simultaneously. Because for avoidant, emotional closeness and sexual availability have inverse relationship driven by how emotional intimacy triggers their wounds. Understanding this pattern helps partner stop taking the sexual withdrawal personally, helps partner recognize the withdrawal isn't about them being undesirable. It is about the avoidance nervous system responding to emotional proximity with need for distance, and sexual withdrawal being how that distance gets created. The unpredictability is the pattern. Inconsistency itself is the consistent feature, driven by their fluctuating tolerance for intimacy. Partners search for pattern. Try to understand what makes avoidance sexually available versus sexually withdrawn. Try to figure out what they did wrong when withdrawal happens, or what they did right when availability appears. But the searching for logical pattern in behavior misses the actual pattern. The unpredictability is the pattern. The inconsistency is the consistent feature. The avoidant's sexual availability fluctuates based on their internal state, their nervous system's current tolerance for intimacy, and their sense of emotional proximity to partner. These internal factors are fluctuating constantly based on things partner often can't see or influence. This makes the pattern seem random, but it's not random. It's responsive to internal state that's invisible to partner. The unpredictability creates anxiety in partner, creates hypervigilance about what might trigger withdrawal, creates walking on eggshells, trying not to do whatever caused the withdrawal last time. But the walking on eggshells doesn't work because the pattern isn't about partner's behavior. It's about avoidance' internal fluctuating state. Understanding that unpredictability is the pattern, that you can't make the sexual availability consistent through your behavior because it's not responsive to your behavior, but to their internal state, helps partner stop taking responsibility for managing something they can't actually manage. The uncomfortable mirror. Turn, if you're seeking this information. To better accommodate their pattern, examine why you're accepting sexual intimacy without emotional intimacy. But if you're the partner reading this trying to understand their pattern, ask yourself honestly, why are you trying to understand rather than deciding this pattern doesn't serve you? Why are you seeking information about how to navigate their unpredictable sexual availability rather than recognizing that relationship where sex is disconnected from emotion isn't relationship that meets your needs? Why are you learning about their trauma responses instead of enforcing boundary that you need integrated intimacy where physical and emotional connection exist together? Because if you're reading this to better accommodate their pattern, to figure out how to get them to be more sexually available, to understand how to avoid triggering their withdrawal, to learn how to manage their unpredictability, you're sacrificing your needs to maintain relationship with someone whose patterns are fundamentally incompatible with what you need. You need integrated intimacy, need emotional and physical connection to coexist, need partner whose sexual desire includes desire for you as whole person, not just desire for regulation or validation or compartmentalized physical release. Their pattern, sex without emotional intimacy, high desire that's actually about regulation rather than connection, unpredictable availability driven by fluctuating tolerance for vulnerability, isn't pattern you can fix through better understanding or better accommodation. Is pattern that reveals they're not capable of what you need. Stop trying to understand how to work within their limitations. Start enforcing boundary that their limitations are incompatible with your needs. Their trauma is real. Their patterns are understandable. And their patterns don't meet your needs for integrated intimacy. Understanding them doesn't make the patterns acceptable. Doesn't make relationship functional. Doesn't mean you should stay in dynamic where you're getting physical intimacy without emotional intimacy, because that's all they can provide. You deserve both. Deserve partner who connects physically and emotionally together. Deserve relationship where sex enhances intimacy rather than substituting for it or creating distance after. Stop accommodating their pattern. Start requiring yours to be met. How the avoidant experiences their own sexual pattern, the internal conflict that creates the external confusion. Understanding the avoidant's internal experience helps explain why the pattern persists. They're often unaware of the contradiction between their behavior and their impact, and they experience desire as genuine, not recognizing it's driven by need for regulation or validation, rather than desire for intimate connection with partner. From inside, the desire feels real, feels like genuine wanting. The avoidant feels sexual desire and interprets it as desire for partner. Doesn't recognize the desire is serving other purposes. Is regulation strategy? Is validation seeking? Is way to create connection without emotional vulnerability? The lack of recognition means they're confused when partner feels used or disconnected. From avoidance perspective, they're showing desire, showing they want partner, showing they're attracted. Why is partner saying sex feels disconnected when to the avoidant, sex feels like intimacy? The gap is between what desire is serving for the avoidant versus what desire means to the partner. For avoidant, desire serves regulation and validation needs while also including genuine attraction. For partner, desire should mean desire for whole person, including emotional intimacy. The avoidant doesn't recognize their desire is compartmentalized, doesn't recognize they're seeking physical connection as substitute for emotional connection they can't access. This lack of recognition perpetuates the pattern. They keep initiating sex thinking they're creating intimacy. Partner keeps feeling disconnected because sex without emotional intimacy isn't intimacy for partner, even though it feels like intimacy to avoidant. They're unaware of the withdrawal pattern. The distancing after intimacy feels like normal need for space, not recognizing it as defensive response to vulnerability. The avoidant experiences the post-sex withdrawal as normal, as just needing space, as reasonable need for independence after period of closeness, doesn't recognize the withdrawal as defensive response to vulnerability that sex created, doesn't see the pattern of intensity followed by withdrawal, doesn't connect the withdrawal to the sex, thinks the withdrawal is just their normal need for space that happens to occur after sex, not defensive response caused by sex creating vulnerability. This lack of awareness means they're confused by partner's hurt. From avoidance perspective, they had great sex, now they need some space, this is normal. From partner's perspective, great sex should increase closeness, not trigger withdrawal. The gap between how avoidant experiences withdrawal as normal need for space and how partner experiences withdrawal as rejection after intimacy is what creates the pain. And avoidance lack of awareness about the pattern perpetuates it. They keep withdrawing after intensity thinking it's normal. Partner keeps getting hurt by withdrawal that feels like rejection. Neither understands the other's experience because avoidant lacks awareness that the withdrawal is pattern, is defensive, is response to vulnerability that sex created. They want to be capable of integrated intimacy. The pattern distresses them when they become aware of it, creating internal conflict between desire for connection and terror of vulnerability. Many avoidants, when pattern is pointed out, recognize they're distressed by it. They want to be capable of integrated intimacy, want emotional and physical connection to exist together, want to not withdraw after intensity, even want their desire to be about genuine connection rather than regulation or validation. The wanting is real, but wanting doesn't create capacity. The terror of vulnerability is more powerful than the desire for connection. The wounds driving the pattern are deeper than the conscious wish to be different. This creates internal conflict. Part of them recognizes the pattern is problematic, recognizes their hurting partner, recognizes their sabotaging relationship. But other part of them, wounded, defended part, is running the pattern because the pattern is protection against vulnerability that feels dangerous to their core self. The internal conflict creates distress but doesn't create change unless they do sustained therapeutic work to address the wounds. The conflict makes them feel bad about themselves, makes them wish they were different. But wishing doesn't transform trauma responses that require professional intervention to modify. What partners need to understand about sexual intimacy. With avoidance, the patterns that indicate whether change is possible. Recognizing which patterns indicate potential for growth versus patterns that indicate someone is too defended to change helps partners make informed decisions about whether to stay. Pattern indicating potential. They recognize the pattern and actively pursue therapeutic work to address attachment wounds. If the avoidant recognizes their sexual pattern is problematic, recognizes the compartmentalization, recognizes the withdrawal after intensity, recognizes the disconnect between physical and emotional intimacy, and actively pursues help, potential exists. Not guarantee, but potential. Active pursuit of help means finding therapist who specializes in attachment trauma, doing the work consistently over extended period, being willing to examine uncomfortable patterns, working to develop capacity for vulnerability. If this is happening, if they're in sustained therapy, doing actual work, not just talking about maybe getting help someday, then pattern might gradually change. Might develop capacity for integrated intimacy where physical and emotional exist together. Might increase tolerance for vulnerability so intensity doesn't trigger withdrawal. Might learn to recognize when desire is regulation seeking versus connection seeking. The change is slow, takes months or years, but possible if they're doing genuine sustained work. This is pattern indicating potential for growth, pattern indicating unlikely change. They defend the pattern, blame partner for being too demanding, or promise to change without doing therapeutic work. If the avoidant defends the pattern when it's pointed out, says, partner is too needy, says, everyone needs space after sex, says, there's nothing wrong with compartmentalizing, says, partner expects too much emotional connection, change is unlikely. Defense of the pattern indicates lack of recognition that pattern is problem. Without recognition, no motivation for change exists. Similarly, if they promise to change without doing therapeutic work, promise to be more emotionally available, promise to stop withdrawing, promise to integrate physical and emotional, change is unlikely. Promises without therapeutic work are just words. The pattern is driven by trauma that requires specialized professional help to address. Promises made during conflict or in response to partner's distress don't create actual capacity to change deeply ingrained trauma responses. The defending or empty promising are patterns indicating they're too defended to do the work change requires. If these patterns are present, partner needs to decide, accept the person as they are, with recognition that sexual intimacy without emotional intimacy is what this relationship offers, or leave to find partner whose capacity matches what you need. Partner's role is recognizing their needs, not fixing the avoidant. If integrated intimacy is what you need, staying with someone who can't provide it sacrifices your well-being for hope that never materializes. Partner's job isn't fixing the avoidant, isn't figuring out how to work within their limitations, isn't accepting physical intimacy without emotional intimacy, because that's all they can provide. Partner's job is recognizing their own needs. If you need integrated intimacy, and most secure people do, then relationship with avoidant who compartmentalizes is relationship that fundamentally doesn't meet your needs. You can't fix them into capacity they don't have. Can't love them into changing patterns that are rooted in trauma, that requires professional intervention. Can't accommodate your way into a relationship that works when the fundamental incompatibility is between their capacity and your needs. Staying and hoping they'll change. Staying and trying to fix. Staying and accommodating. And staying and sacrificing your need for emotional intimacy, because physical intimacy is present, is sacrificing your well-being for hope that almost never materializes. Most avoidants don't do the therapeutic work. Most defend their patterns or make empty promises. Most stay in their defended position because the defended position feels safer than the vulnerability that change requires. Recognize your needs, Recognize their capacity. Recognize the gap. Recognize staying in the gap, waiting for them to bridge it, usually just means years of unmet needs while they remain defended. Choose yourself. Choose your needs. Choose relationship with someone who can provide integrated intimacy, where physical and emotional connection coexist, rather than staying with someone who can only provide one without the other. On the complex reality, when high sexual desire coexists with intimacy avoidance, the final truth about avoidant attachment and sexual intimacy is that high desire and low capacity can coexist, creating relationships that are intensely physical but emotionally hollow. They can want sex frequently while avoiding emotional closeness. The two aren't contradictory but complementary in their system, with sex serving as substitute for emotional intimacy. The avoidant might have high sex drive, might want physical intimacy frequently, might be great sexual partner in technical sense, and simultaneously might avoid emotional intimacy completely. The two coexist because in avoidant system, they're complementary. Sex substitutes for emotional intimacy, provides way to feel connected without emotional vulnerability. High sex drive serves their need for connection, while low emotional availability protects them from vulnerability. Both serve the defended system. Both maintain the pattern that keeps them safe while keeping them stuck. For partner, the coexistence is confusing and painful. Physical desire is present. They want you, want sex, seem attracted. But emotional intimacy is absent. They won't open up, won't be vulnerable, won't connect beyond physical. Having one without the other creates relationship that feels incomplete, creates feeling of being wanted only for body, creates sense something essential is missing, even though physical connection exists. The coexistence is the pattern. Understanding the coexistence helps partner stop trying to convert physical desire into emotional intimacy, helps partner recognize that for avoidant, the two are separate enough that one can be high while other is low, and high physical desire doesn't indicate capacity for emotional intimacy is developing. The intensity of the physical connection can mask the absence of emotional intimacy, creating illusion of deep relationship that falls apart when emotional needs arise. The sex might be intense, passionate, physically connecting. The intensity creates illusion that deep relationship exists. Partner feels the physical intensity and interprets it as emotional intensity, feels the sexual connection and assumes emotional connection exists alongside it. The intensity masks the absence, masks the compartmentalization, masks the fact that emotional intimacy isn't present despite physical intensity being present. The illusion works until something happens that requires emotional intimacy, and crisis occurs. Partner needs emotional support. Conflict arises that requires vulnerable conversation. Relationship milestone approaches that requires emotional commitment. When emotional intimacy is required, the absence becomes undeniable. The avoidant can't provide it. The illusion shatters. Partner recognizes the physical intensity was masking emotional absence rather than indicating emotional presence. The recognition is painful, feels like betrayal, even though betrayal wasn't intentional. Feels like the relationship was lie, even though the physical connection was real. The physical intensity and emotional absence can coexist. The coexistence creates illusion that falls apart when relationship requires more than physical. Understanding this helps partner recognize that physical intensity doesn't prove emotional intimacy exists. Need to assess emotional intimacy directly, rather than assuming physical intimacy indicates emotional intimacy is present. Partners deserve integrated intimacy. If physical without emotional isn't sufficient, leaving someone whose trauma prevents integration is choosing yourself, not abandoning them. You deserve both. Deserve physical and emotional intimacy together. Deserve partner who connects with you fully, body and heart and mind. Deserve relationship where sexual intensity enhances emotional connection rather than substituting for it. If the avoidant can't provide integrated intimacy, if physical is present but emotional is absent, if sexual desire is high but emotional availability is low, staying is accepting relationship that fundamentally doesn't meet your needs. Leaving isn't abandoning them. Leaving is recognizing their trauma prevents them from providing what you need and choosing yourself over staying in relationship that leaves you feeling incomplete. Their trauma is real. Their patterns are understandable. Their patterns don't meet your needs. All three can be true. Leaving someone whose trauma prevents them from meeting your needs is self-care, not cruelty. Is recognizing you deserve what they can't provide. Is choosing yourself over sacrificing your needs indefinitely for someone who might never develop capacity to meet those needs. They need therapeutic work to change. You need integrated intimacy now. These needs are incompatible. Recognize the incompatibility. Choose yourself. Find partner who can provide physical and emotional intimacy together rather than staying with someone who can only provide one while defending against the other. Understanding the specific manifestations of attachment trauma in sexual behavior helps both avoidants and partners recognize when patterns are protective mechanisms rather than preferences or personality traits. They initiate sex after conflict instead of having repair conversations, using physical reconnection to avoid emotional vulnerability that repair requires. After argument or conflict, secure pattern is repair conversation, talking through what happened, expressing feelings, apologizing, reconnecting emotionally before reconnecting physically. But avoidant often skips directly to initiating sex, uses physical reconnection as substitute for emotional repair. The pattern serves their defense. Conflict created emotional exposure, created vulnerability, created need to talk about feelings. All of this feels threatening, but initiating sex after conflict creates reconnection without requiring emotional vulnerability. Creates way to make up that doesn't involve talking about feelings or being vulnerable. Creates path back to stability that bypasses the emotional repair they're avoiding. Partners often accept this. Accept the physical reconnection as repair. But accepting physical without emotional repair means the underlying issue isn't addressed. The conflict's emotional content isn't processed. The pattern repeats because root cause isn't resolved through physical reconnection alone. Recognizing this pattern helps partner enforce boundary. We repair emotionally before reconnecting physically. This boundary might be difficult for avoidant, but it's necessary for relationship health. Sex after conflict without emotional repair is avoidance strategy, not genuine reconnection. Requiring emotional repair first teaches avoidant that conflicts require emotional processing, not just physical resolution. They prefer sex that's intense but brief, avoiding extended intimate sessions that would require sustained vulnerability and emotional presence. Notice the duration pattern. Sex might be intense, but it's relatively brief. Avoidant often prefers shorter encounters over extended intimate sessions, prefers intensity over duration. This preference isn't about stamina or physical limitation. It's about tolerance for vulnerability. Extended intimate sessions require sustained presence, require being emotionally available for longer period, require more vulnerability than brief, intense encounters. Brief intensity allows them to be present physically without requiring extended emotional presence, allows them to experience connection without the sustained vulnerability that longer sessions would require. Partners might notice this pattern, but not understand its meaning. Might think avoidant just prefers quick sex, but preference for brief, overextended, is often about managing vulnerability tolerance. Extended intimacy requires more emotional presence than their defended system can sustain comfortably. Recognizing this pattern helps partner understand that suggestions for longer, more connected intimate sessions might trigger avoidance withdrawal, not because they're not attracted, but because extended intimacy requires vulnerability that feels threatening. And this understanding doesn't mean accepting only brief encounters if extended intimacy is what you need. It means recognizing the pattern reveals their limited capacity for sustained vulnerability, which is information about whether relationship can meet your needs. They may pursue novelty or intensity to maintain arousal, needing increased stimulation because emotional connection that sustains desire in secure relationships is unavailable to them. Some avoidants pursue novelty in sexual relationship, new positions, new scenarios, increased intensity. The pursuit might seem like healthy sexual exploration, but sometimes the pursuit is compensating for lack of emotional connection that sustains desire in secure relationships. Secure people maintain sexual desire through combination of physical attraction and emotional connection. Emotional intimacy enhances physical desire, makes routine sex satisfying because emotional connection is present. But for avoidant who compartmentalizes, who has physical without emotional connection isn't enhancing desire. This means they need other things to maintain arousal: novelty, intensity, stimulation that compensates for the emotional component that's missing. The pursuit of novelty isn't a problem in itself. It becomes concerning when novelty is required, when routine sex becomes uninteresting, not because of normal habituation, but because emotional connection that should sustain desire through routine is absent. Partners notice this when avoidant needs constantly increasing novelty to maintain interest, when regular sex stops being satisfying even though physical attraction exists, and the need for escalating novelty can reveal the emotional connection that should sustain desire isn't present, requiring external stimulation to compensate for missing internal emotional component. Why some avoidants develop compulsive sexual patterns when sex becomes primary regulation strategy. Understanding when sexual behavior crosses into compulsive territory helps distinguish between high sex drive and sex being used as primary emotional management tool. Sex becomes anxiety management, using physical release to regulate nervous system that can't be regulated through emotional processing or healthy coping. For some avoidants, sex becomes primary strategy for managing anxiety. Feel anxious about work, seek sex. Feel anxious about relationship, seek sex. Feel generally anxious about life, seek sex. The sex provides temporary relief, provides nervous system regulation, provides escape from anxiety that feels unmanageable through other means. This creates compulsive quality. The seeking isn't about desire for partner or even desire for pleasure primarily. Is about needing the anxiety relief that sex provides. The compulsive quality means frequency might be high, but satisfaction is low. Each sexual encounter provides temporary relief, but underlying anxiety returns, requiring another encounter. The cycle maintains itself. Anxiety triggers sexual seeking. Sex provides temporary relief. Relief is temporary, so anxiety returns. Returning anxiety triggers more sexual seeking. Partners experience this as being wanted sexually, but feel the wanting is about what sex does for the avoidant rather than about genuine desire for partner. The compulsive quality creates feeling of being used even when use isn't conscious intention. Recognizing this pattern helps partner understand the high sex drive isn't flattering or about attraction. is about avoidant using sex as emotional regulation strategy because they can't regulate through healthier means like emotional processing or talking about feelings. They may separate sex from relational context. Ability to be sexual with partner while relationship is troubled indicates compartmentalization serving defensive function. Secure people generally can't maintain sexual desire when relationship is troubled. Conflict decreases desire. Emotional disconnection decreases arousal. Relationship problems make sex feel wrong or impossible until problems are addressed. But some avoidants maintain sexual desire even when relationship is clearly troubled. Can want sex during period of emotional disconnection. Can initiate during time when relationship issues are unresolved. This ability to be sexual, regardless of relational context, reveals the compartmentalization. Sex exists in separate box from emotional relationship. Physical desire is separate from emotional connection. Can access one without the other being present. This compartmentalization serves defense, protects them from having to address relationship problems because they can maintain physical connection while emotional connection is broken. Partners find this disturbing. Find that avoidant. Wanting sex when relationship is troubled feels wrong. Feels like avoidant isn't affected by the relationship problems the way partner is affected. The disturbance is valid. The pattern reveals sex is compartmentalized from relationship health in ways that prevent relationship problems from being addressed because physical connection can continue while emotional connection is broken. The compulsivity masks deeper intimacy issues. High sexual frequency can create illusion of intimate relationship while preventing genuine emotional intimacy from developing. High sexual frequency can create illusion, can make it seem like intimate relationship exists, can make both people believe connection is present because physical intimacy is frequent. But frequent sex can actually prevent emotional intimacy from developing. If sex is happening frequently, avoidant might believe they're being intimate, might point to sexual frequency as proof they're connected. Might resist partner's request for emotional intimacy by saying, "But we have sex all the time," as if sexual frequency proves intimacy exists. The frequency masks the absence, masks that emotional intimacy isn't present, masks that sex is substituting for emotional connection rather than enhancing it. Partners feel the absence but have difficulty articulating it when sexual frequency is high. How do you say you don't feel intimate with someone you're having frequent sex with? The difficulty of articulating the absence while frequency is high is what allows the pattern to persist. Partner feels something is missing, but can't quite name it because physical intimacy is present. Recognizing that high sexual frequency can mask rather than indicate genuine intimacy helps partner name what's missing: emotional intimacy. Physical frequency doesn't prove emotional intimacy exists. Need to assess emotional intimacy separately from sexual frequency. High sexual frequency with low emotional intimacy is pattern indicating compartmentalization is occurring, not pattern indicating intimate relationship exists. The path forward for both avoidants and their partners when sexual patterns can change and when they can't. Understanding what creates possibility for change versus what indicates patterns are too entrenched helps both people make informed decisions about the relationship's future. For avoidants, recognizing sex is regulation strategy rather than intimacy is first step. Awareness must precede therapeutic work addressing underlying wounds. If you're the avoidant reading this and recognizing your patterns, our first step is recognizing what sex is serving for you. Is it regulation? Is it validation? Is it way to create connection without vulnerability? Is it anxiety management? Is it substitute for emotional intimacy you can't access? The recognition is painful. Means acknowledging you're using sex for purposes beyond connection with partner. Means admitting the compartmentalization. Means seeing the pattern you've been defending or denying. But recognition is necessary first step. Without recognizing what sex is serving, can't address why it's serving those functions. Can't do the work of developing other regulation strategies. Can't build capacity for emotional intimacy that would allow sex to be integrated with emotional connection rather than separated from it. After recognition comes therapeutic work. Sustained work with attachment specialist. Work addressing the early wounds that made emotional vulnerability feel dangerous. Work developing capacity for sustained vulnerability. Work learning to integrate physical and emotional intimacy. Work developing regulation strategies beyond sex. The work is uncomfortable, takes years, requires confronting wounds you've spent lifetime avoiding. But work is what creates change. Recognition without therapeutic work just creates awareness of pattern without capacity to change it.